First up on the agenda, what is horror? This is a question I began to ask myself when I started getting into horror films because I realized there were a bunch of horror films I was finding that were not scary. Over some time, I began to wonder if horror was just a theme for media, almost like a setting. You know, how you could say My Python the Holy Grail is set in medieval England. Technically, I guess because it is my Python after all. So maybe a horror film didn't need to be scary, it just needed horror characters, aka vampires, ghosts, some kind of demon or demonic spirit, and maybe a kid with weird powers. What I'm saying is, horror doesn't have to be scary. Enter LiEat. 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 Yeah, I love it when a title for a game merges two words together and is now pronounced completely differently. LiEat is a curious little game because it is split into 3 chapters. Each chapter is maybe 30 minutes long and is presented in episodic format. Starting with the first game, you play as Effie and Leo, and you have arrived at a town named Vermilion as it is approaching nightfall. Effie is a little girl and Leo is a traveler. Right, so what's actually going on here is a lie. Effie is in fact a little girl, but I omitted the fact that she's a dragon that can eat lies. Leo is, well, not named Leo, but I will just call him Leo for now. Anyway, they roll into town and talk to this person about some mythical bird. Leo gives them a feather and gets paid. This interaction also demonstrates the game's battle system in case you didn't run into these little demon monsters outside. I don't have anything to say about the battle system, it's pretty self-explanatory. We then find out this woman's been in town because she suspects this town's vampire legend is real. Everyone in the audience start taking notes. This story is very difficult to follow. Skipping to nighttime, you wake up to a scream in the night heard throughout town, and it turns out that the informant you talked to before is dead. Man, how unexpected. Constable Neil and Deputy Brett are on the scene about several hours later, and it turns out Leo knows them. It also turns out they're both dragons, like Effie, and right now I just noticed Brett looks like Knuckles. Yeah, I'm going to stop playing stupid. In this first episode of LiEat, you have to piece together the clues to find the completely not obvious vampire who killed someone in town. So, now this is an adventure game. You go around and ask people for information that may or may not be true and get enough evidence to basically convict this person. In a way, it's not a bad design because how the justice system is supposed to work is the cops have to find the evidence to convict. Remember, the rule is supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. So walking around town asking people for information regarding the crime and even trying to find physical evidence to suggest who the vampire is a good concept. Basically narrowing down the suspect should be part of the gameplay here, except it is hard to do that when this game doesn't exactly make that a challenge. But my problem with this game was more so that I just had to brute force my way through it. There was a tiny bit of dialogue that was relevant to the story, but ultimately I had to find this photograph. It opened a dialogue tree with Brett, which then let me go back to the photo and have Effie actually realize what this book title says. Oh yeah, she's like 4 or something, so she doesn't know how to read. Either way, I'm split on this mechanic because it is doing one of the things I don't like about adventure games, yet this is sort of what a detective mystery game should be. But at the same time, the story isn't exactly on par with Finding Rosebud. I think the visuals are very nice along with the music. The sprite work fits the game perfectly in large part because of the color palette, I'd say. I noticed this during some dialogue, but the fact that everything in this town is in this semi-monochrome color palette, yet all the important characters are different colors, it actually makes important shit stand out better. As for the music, there's some interesting choices. One of these songs starts off on a measure that sounds very similar to You and Owen Was Her. Yeah, it's different enough where it isn't You and Owen, but it still throws me off. But even so, there's another song that straight up is Take 5. Yeah, you can't convince me this isn't Take 5. Though I guess I can't blame this game for taking a 5-beat jazz standard and using it in this game because some of my older videos did a similar thing.
Gage, you're still recording, right?
What? The battle themes in this game are pretty cool, but there is one thing I happened to find by accident. A little editor's secret, but when going back through the footage for this video, I discovered by accident if you play the final boss theme at 2x speed, it sounds pretty cool. Honestly, if there isn't a remix of this song out there yet, that's a missed opportunity. Though perhaps what sets apart LiEat is the use of animated cutscenes. That alone kind of sets this game apart from other RPG Maker horror games, since not a lot choose to do this. It's pretty cool actually, even if they are only for a couple of seconds, because it just adds to the aesthetic of this game. Though I don't think that is enough to really save it. Look, the first chapter of this game feels stupidly simple, almost like an illiterate child can complete it, but why not check out the other 2 chapters as well? Well, LiEat 2 is much the same. This time, Hal is going to some resort in the sky disguised as a guard. The scenario this time, a Dream Eater. Honestly, because all my previous comments can apply to both the second chapter and the final chapter, I won't spend too much time on this section. It is this section, though, that I think the game drops the tutorial chains. I think the best way to describe the difference in these 2 games is as follows. The first chapter pretty much reveals all of its cards the moment the murder happens. In the second chapter, while it's clear who is responsible for the weird shit happening at the resort, there's more development into not only what happens, but also why it happens. To not spoil this one, because I think this chapter is worth playing if you're going to try any of these 3 chapters, let's just say there was a pattern in the weird events happening at the resort that is separate from the dream-eating dragon. And as for the final chapter, well, this is the best one, and it's kind of a shame too, because LiEat firmly ends after this chapter. The one negative I have to say about this chapter is this one obtusely difficult puzzle. Maybe I'm stupid, but this puzzle made no sense to me and felt pretty pointless. But I like this chapter. The 2 previous chapters developed the fantasy logic of this universe and this character's story so well, so by the end of it, I actually wish there was more. Sid, as he calls himself in this game, sees his backstory fleshed out greatly in this game, but then it all just stops because this is where the game ends. Yeah, and it was just starting to get good too. So, to reiterate, Chapter 1 was the tutorial level, Chapter 2 was the first actually interesting part of the game, and Chapter 3 was like, alright, here's some hard shit and here's some good shit, now bye. There was actually another pretty cool feature introduced in this chapter that unfortunately is exclusive to this chapter. At one point, you could team up with different dragons to advance through different puzzles. Fuck man, this already adds a lot of potential for the series because this is actually a good gameplay mechanic. But alas, the game ends here. So, should you play this game? I mean, why the fuck not? Maybe you'll have to spend 30 minutes getting through the first chapter, but Chapter 2 is actually pretty good, and Chapter 3 is really good. I hope there's another trilogy that gets released for this game because this is a good format for a game. Have 1-hour mysteries that feel kinda like episodes in a show and release them maybe once a year. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine if instead of a new game that lasts about 5 hours being released by a developer once every 3 or 4 years, they instead made an hour-long chapter and released that every 8 to 12 months. You could easily market that to keep people interested in your game for longer, but the trade-off of guaranteeing new content at least once a year. Telltale used to do this before they shut down, and I'm pretty sure this is basically what's happening with Deltarune. Now let's return to the question of this video. Is this an RPG Maker horror game? Well, yes, it's definitely far from scary, but there are some horror elements at play here. Though, honestly, it does seem more fantasy than horror, at least something like scary horror. I mean, yeah, if a Skyrim dragon existed and was attacking New York, that'd be scary, but we're talking about cat girls that are part dragon and not part cat, so while Yume Nikki is psychological horror, Misao and Mad Father are about on par with slasher horror, Eating Lies is about as scary as pop-up Halloween stores. Actually, Halloween stores might be scarier, because who's responsible for these stores and why do they always pop up at the exact same fucking time in the exact same abandoned places around town? So fuck all the rainbows and sunshine, we're in a slaughterhouse now. From the start, there isn't really anything too special about Purgatory on the surface compared to the previous games I've covered. I'm almost reminded of Misao because you can die in quite a few different ways in this game. At the end of the day, it really is just a game with a fair bit of walking, some problem solving, and eventually you get to the end. Now with that said, I think this game's strength is with the environment and sound design. The game feels a bit slow at the start, but consistently feels uncomfortable. Now on one hand, it is almost comical the amount of blood in this game. Entire hallways are red. There's literally a wall of flesh that blocks your path. I mean hell, Envy's sprite might as well just be red. The amount of blood in this game rivals a Quentin Tarantino film, though I suppose there is a bit of a justification here since we are in a slaughterhouse after all. No less, this game definitely plays up horror tropes to an extreme. Go figure, you're being chased by this masked killer. Oh boy, maybe there's also some kind of childhood trauma. Yeah, I mean, it's close enough. You're in this situation because of some friends at school. Well, anyway, this is a game that's about an hour long that does feel a lot more like a concept as opposed to a fully fleshed out story. Like, seriously, the game is generic at best, but the game succeeds at converting a generic horror film story into a game. But there is a little thing I do want to talk about, so spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1... The standard ending for this game is the bad ending, aka you escape but get caught again by the killer, and immediately die. But there is a good ending to this game that is kinda badass. You have to get this demonic axe, which upon grabbing it immediately makes Inri look pretty badass. Inri doesn't have to say shit anymore, even though she was mute throughout the whole game. You can tell no one's fucking with Inri. With this demonic axe, you're able to enter this part of the game and get help from a spider. Try not to get consumed by this pink sludge, and eventually you exit. Upon exiting, Inri begins to feel weird. Well, turns out, picking up a demonic axe may not have been such a good idea. Or was it? I'll just let the cutscene play out. Technically, this is a horror game where the protagonist fights back, but I suppose the downside is that she did turn into a demon. I mean, all things considered, maybe that isn't such a bad trade-off. Look, she did kill a serial killer and kidnapper who was a serious threat to society at large. Who knows how many other people would have fallen victim to this killer if Inri didn't become a demon and kill the killer. So with that said, Purgatory is overall pretty average of a game. Even with the section of the game I thought was cool and I put in the spoiler section, that isn't enough to save it in my eyes. Moving on, I overestimated how long it would take to play 4 games. I thought, oh, 4 hours each? I can do it in 2. Yeah, no. The Strange Men series is a long series and shouldn't be played in one go like how I played it. It is a total of 15 to 20 hours to go through the whole thing. Oh, and that's if you do one ending because there's multiple endings to these games. Now, with that said, the Strange Men are a pretty well made series of games. They are pretty different from each other, yet what keeps them in this series is recurring characters. For instance, The Crooked Man is really dark. It is about a man trying to find someone who used to live in the apartment he just moved into, and by tracking this person down, he ends up facing his own conditions in life. It is the story of David Hoover, who appears in every game after this one. Well, the second game is The Sandman, and it's about Sophie Grundler, who has insomnia. Yes, The Strange Men went from maybe 1 levels of horror and dread to Fear the Dark, over just 1 entry in the series. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I probably would have gotten tired of the series if every game was about the same. As a brief overview, The Crooked Man is, as I said before, a game about someone's reflection on their own life and the troubles they've gone through. The Sandman is much more lighthearted, but does develop off of childhood dreams and nightmares, making it a really cool concept for a game. The Boogeyman comes off as a strange detective, mystery, Batman, Joker hybrid. And lastly, the Hanged Man can best be described as Sixth Sense, but with urban exploration. Sort of. So then how should I go about talking about these games? Well, I just won't talk too much about the stories themselves. Look, I think these games are worth playing. Talking about the stories would not only take a lot of time, but also inherently spoil the games. So if you are interested in the series, then let me tell you a few things I wish I knew before playing. Afterward, I'll give you my thoughts on each game. So number 1, each game does something slightly different. They're all basically told from the point of view of the main character in each game, occasionally throwing in an alternate angle. But for the most part, you play as some character within the universe of this world. That brings me to number 2. There's theoretically not a required order to experience this series. You could probably play the Boogeyman and leave it there. Not because it sums up the whole series, but because each game really is its own. I've heard this series called both the Strange Men series and the Strange Men Anthology, and that is because you don't need to play the Crooked Man to play any of the other games in this series. With that said, number 3, it would be worth playing all of these, but maybe spread out over some time. My favorite was probably the Boogeyman because you played a detective mystery game. After that, the Crooked Man I enjoyed because its dark story kept me interested in the game. The Sandman was alright. I mean, the story was pretty decent, but it did feel the most detached from the series. The Crooked Man felt a bit like the Catcher in the Rye. The Boogeyman felt like a cross between the Joker from The Dark Knight mixed with House on Haunted Hill and a shot of Danganronpa. But the Sandman maybe is Beetlejuice. The Hanged Man feels so weird putting it right next to the Crooked Man because Yuri really got better at making games by the time this one came out. The setting looks better. The story is really good, to the point that it was playing out like a film in my head, and the overall refinement in the puzzles and pacing of the game is on full display. But I am getting ahead of myself. So let's start with the beginning. The Crooked Man, you play as David Hoover. You're trying to find a person who used to live in your apartment, and while on this adventure, you meet people who seem to share similar misfortunes to you. By the end of the game, you get a good conclusion to the whole affair that does end in David having grown as a character. Well, here's the thing. The good ending. I don't really agree with something that happens at the end. Let's just say someone is there at the end who shouldn't be there in my eyes. All I'll say is this someone, just like David, is a recurring character in the series. But based on the events of this first game, they should be out of the picture completely. Special message to the people who have played the game. They left him and should have moved on because that would have shown growth as a person within the context of everything else happening at the end. The Sandman. Sophie Grundler has insomnia. As I said before, this would be like Metallica playing One, then doing a cover of Fear of the Dark. This is not to say Fear of the Dark is bad, but it does demonstrate the vast quantity of flavors of metal music. This game is nowhere near as dark as the previous game. However, it still has some dark moments. The thing I like about this game is how it takes on the childhood fear of being scared at night. To a child, nighttime may be scary, but then to an adult, Blair Witch is fucking boring. So I respect the alternate take on a horror game, especially since the perversion of bedtime stories and lullabies into something much scarier is a common horror trope. Just be sure to say your prayers and don't forget to include. So remember when I said there's recurring characters? Well, Keith Baring meets David Hoover and Sophie Grundler in addition to a couple other people on vacation. Keith is a detective, and while on vacation, some weird shit happens, and now there's a boogeyman doing Joker-like things. Yeah, at some point I was expecting this guy to talk about how all his killing is about sending a message or something. Either way, I really like this entry. All these games I've covered so far in this video are basically just adventure games, right? I mean, there's sort of a health system that is used in this series, but let's be honest, there's not a lot of fighting happening in these games. So if the whole gameplay loop of these games is to solve shit and figure out a mystery, then why not just play as Robert Downey Jr.? I mean Sherlock Holmes. This game had a decent amount of action in it, all things considered. Keith gets pretty beat up by the end. The path that Keith must take to save his wife goes all over the fucking place, and trust me when I say the boogeyman is as chaotic as the Joker. Hell, at one point I was expecting him to tear a man's balls off before I remembered I can't show castration on YouTube. Now with that said, I do have a couple complaints. For one, this is actually the first entry in the series that employs the use of voice actors. Yeah. I turned that off from the start.
Huh. I thought you were supposed to be scary.
You still hear some snippets throughout the game. They are pretty amateur at best, so yeah. Unless you want voice acting in your RPG Maker horror game, you already know what your preference is going to be. But in addition to that, I'm kind of annoyed with Sophie's character in this game. Now, in The Sandman, there are a couple times where she is rude, but she generally is calm, nice, or at a minimum justified in her actions. She's fucking spoiled in this game. I'm not joking. Between Sandman and Boogeyman, she became Daddy's princess, and I fucking hate that. Now, with that said, in The Hanged Man, she's not really like that at all, so I have no fucking clue what happened to you. Though, before moving on to the last game, I do want to suggest one possible reason for this: narrative bias. It could be possible Yuri did a clever thing here and made it where the story in each game is distorted by the protagonist. I mean, to put it loosely, each game has the protagonist dealing with their demons, so maybe because Keith doesn't like Sophie, he views her as a spoiled brat in a much more distorted view than she actually is. Likewise, Sophie is attracted to David in her game and views him basically without all his flaws, while David pretty pretty much sees himself as the most flawed person on Earth in his story. So hey, if this is what Yuri was trying to do, I give a thumbs up to that because that's pretty cool and they did a great job. So with The Hanged Man, the protagonist is a middle schooler named Will Morton. Of course, the previous 3 protagonists show up in some way, and just as a heads up, there's a lot of allusions made to the past game with these characters. I said before you could play these in any order, but I do recommend playing them in their release order. Does that break the experience? Not really. But I can't really envision a reason to play them out of order. So, we're a kid who ran away from home who decides to go urban exploring in a fucking mental hospital. I'm not joking, that's the plot, and that's all you really know for a while. Hell, Will doesn't even speak for like a good half hour. Instead, this rat named Pop does most of the talking. Yeah, this felt really stupid to me at the beginning, having a talking animal or imaginary friend, but it actually is relevant to the plot. Let me just say it straight, I really liked this one. I still think The Boogeyman was better, with its story and big revelation being much more hard-hitting, but The Hanged Man is just a really refined experience. One clear example of this is how the game actually has a map that makes sense. There was never a point in The Boogeyman where I felt like I had spatial awareness of the fucking map. You get so turned around in that game. Meanwhile, I never got confused about where I was in this hospital. Well, except for one time, which I'll get to in a moment. How Yuri designed the map was for some rooms to rotate, or really for the camera to rotate. As an example, frequently you'll walk down only to enter a room from walking up. It isn't that bad, but it does start to get fucking complicated for no reason in The Boogeyman. Now, I know I just said I didn't get confused in The Hanged Man a single time, but there was this one hallway that threw me off to the point where I was going to talk about in this video. It really was just this one hallway, but I wondered if maybe I was being dumb. So I spent an hour recreating the whole map of the game just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't. Link in the description to the video where I prove how this mental hospital breaks the laws of space and time, because as it turns out, this game may have just done a better job at hiding this continuity issue. So because of that, I think The Hanged Man did a better job of not making me feel lost when compared to The Boogeyman. But the spatial continuity problem that exists in both of these games is still a complaint I have with the series. And that is where I'm going to end this video. The Strange Men series is worth checking out and playing. You can easily find it on Steam or on VG Person's translation blog. There are multiple endings to these games, some of which are achieved by completely replaying the game. This made getting footage difficult because initially I was getting footage for all the endings, but after thinking about some, I decided it wasn't worth my time to have to play these games twice for a bonus cutscene. One Shot is a game I played maybe a couple months ago that had a New Game Plus type of ending, and in that one, there was an entirely different story to what happens the first time around. So in my opinion, I would rather replay a game for a different ending so long as it is significant enough to do so, and from looking around a bit, it doesn't seem like this series ever met that threshold to justify spending double my time on it. Wait, I forgot something. So it's the month of April. If you're watching this on the same day this video was released, there's only 5 days left in April. But it's still April. So, April Fools, none of these games were made in RPG Maker. Yes, none of these RPG Maker games were made in RPG Maker. All of these games were made in Wolf RPG Editor, but it's not like that was obvious. I asked in the last part if an RPG Maker horror game had to be in RPG Maker. Today I've demonstrated that a horror game doesn't have to be scary, and now I've shown that a game not made in RPG Maker can share characteristics, or at a minimum, the feeling of an RPG Maker horror game. So where does that bring us? Now granted, it can be argued that Wolf RPG was a clone of RPG Maker, but that just further demonstrates how RPG Maker horror game comes down to a set of characteristics befitting a genre. So like I said in the previous part, RPG Maker is simply a set of tools. However, from these tools, they have spawned a certain design, approach, and feel for RPG Maker horror games. So with that revelation out of the way, we're going overtime. There's one game I played recently that caught my attention, and honestly, out of all the games I've talked about in this video, this is my favorite one. On occasion, perhaps once a year, I'll go to a proper art gallery. I'm not talking about a small local gallery you might see in a seaside town, though on some trips I've been to those. Instead, I'm talking about how I once went to the Yale Art Gallery in 2019, or the Smithsonian Art Museum in 2018. Sometimes going to these galleries is a mixed bag of an experience. For instance, one time at Yale, I saw a painting the size of a wall that was just a solid color. Yeah, I don't know, this doesn't really do it for me. But then in like the next room over, there was some cool looking abstract stuff. I think a lot of people, including myself, have some complaints about modern art. Though it is fully subjective, there are moments I'll see from the art world that does make me think, man, they really did just sell that for $3 million. Oh, how naive I was when I wrote that sentence. How utterly naive I was. The same complaints that can be raised about NFTs are basically the same complaints that were raised and have been raised about some modern art. But I digress, because IB is a game about getting sucked into art. Literally. I don't know how I didn't know about IB's premise until like 2 weeks before recording it for this video. But enough said, IB is a 9-year-old girl who goes to an art gallery for her birthday. When she walks in with her parents, somehow she's allowed to go past reception and into the gallery while her parents buy tickets. Alright, pause. Unless the gallery is free, why is a child who might knock over a statue allowed to enter the gallery but the parents still have to buy tickets first? Actually, no, that still doesn't even make sense. Why is this guy not saying, no, you can't go into the gallery unattended? All I'm saying is a little bit of common sense might dictate that first, you can't enter a venue that requires a ticket without getting a ticket, and second, a little kid shouldn't be allowed to just walk into a gallery without their parents. Kids like grabbing and touching shit. I don't care if you're the most well-behaved child in the world, if I can count your age on both hands, you need an adult with you at all times when in an art gallery. Alright, let's continue. So the premise of this game is you're walking through an exhibit for an artist who I guess was a big shot in the art world. At first, you look around at their paintings and eventually stumble across one that begins to transform the world you're in. You then end up entering a painting on the ground, bringing you to the main setting of this game. Already, I love this premise. There's a lot of potential with this idea that I think the game maximizes very well. An artist's work has a lot of meaning to it, a lot of different themes, a lot of interesting visuals, so on and so forth. There's careers dedicated to analyzing what an artist meant when they painted something. In addition, there's a lot of potential for cool visual set pieces for this game. Think about how amazing it would be if a game was set in a Van Gogh painting, a Hokusai woodblock painting, or a Da Vinci or Michelangelo painting. And honestly, this game almost explores these very ideas. Here's an example of what I mean when using the artist's work to do game design. There is this one enemy in the game that is a woman in a painting. The lady in red will chase you and attack you. The in-game lore for this painting is that the artist painted a woman who was chasing after him, not out of love, but for his money. I would assume this means the artist either initially loved this woman and grew to resent her, or knew what she was trying to do, painted her anyway, and saw her as a twisted creature, of whom we see in the game chasing after IB. And that's the thing, a lot of this game's content comes back to the original premise of being stuck in the artistic vision of a now deceased artist. The actual gameplay of this RPG is simply more in line with an adventure game. There are puzzles to solve, there's items and keys to find, there's a bit of a health bar, but ultimately the game is about solving puzzles. You do meet a guy named Gary who also got trapped in the paintings and just like you, also has a rose. Losing all the petals on your rose means you die in the painting world. Ultimately, both of you are trying to get out of these paintings, but until you do that, there's definitely some interesting world logic on display. For instance, at one point, you play hide and seek with a stick figure, and until you find said stick figure, you uncover different paintings that proceed to change the environment in this room. For instance, this moon painting turns the room to night. This hand painting leaves a red handprint on your screen, and this one painting with a music note actually cuts out the music. And yeah, I suppose there's also a few disturbing things in this game. There's a lot of instances of things hanging from rope. There's a crayon cartoon that you watch to unlock a door, which is done by a girl cutting open another girl to retrieve a key she swallowed by accident. I'm gonna be honest, this game does a great job setting the feeling of unease and creepiness with really just the music alone. I didn't find the game particularly scary, but I do think there's a fair amount of psychological fuckery happening. Alright, brief spoiler section for the last half of this game. So you meet Mary, a girl who just happens to also be in the same situation as both you and Gary are in. At one point, the party gets split where Gary is by himself and you're stuck with Mary. Like, no shit, the next room is where this happens. I'll return to this in just a moment. Anyway, Now you have to find a way to get back to Gary, which involves this complex puzzle section that I actually quite enjoyed. So, while split up from Gary, you have a conversation with Mary who asks you if only 2 of the 3 of you could make it out, would you pick Mary or Gary? So, remember when I said about 3 sentences ago that you guys just got split up? Yeah, at this point, while Ib may have also just met Gary like an hour prior, at this point, Gary has demonstrated some kind of kindness and willingness to protect Ib. Mary hasn't done shit and is asking Ib if she would pick her or Gary to save. So let's return to Gary. At this point, he's going through some psychological torment, thinking this creepy doll is following him. Well, in the upcoming puzzle section, part of it involves getting trapped in this room with dolls and having to cut open different dolls' stomachs to find a key to escape this room before getting killed by a bigger doll. So, one set of endings in this game actually involve Gary dying or going insane, but all my footage is of Gary not succumbing to his fears. These endings are essentially how Ib stays with Mary to the end. Oh, but hold up, Gary discovers a little secret of Mary's. So meanwhile, Mary starts to go crazy. Ib is just trying to get out of this brown room, and eventually Mary almost kills Ib, but Gary is able to save Ib in just enough time. Now, because I want to leave this spoiler section in just a moment, I'll skip to the conclusion of Mary. Mary was a painting, she wasn't actually a human, and she wanted to keep Ib in the paintings. This is what Gary discovers, and eventually how Mary dies is by setting her painting on fire. If you find a painting, you can burn it, where she too burns, just like the clown in The Sims. So long and short about these endings, it's all in these characters' heads to some degree. These characters are experiencing the artist's world, including any surreal element of it, but a consequence of that is they find themselves trapped in the world, or breaking down mentally. For instance, one of the endings is Gary gets out, but Ib stays because the lady in red, who looked a lot like her mother, entices her to stay in the paintings. Hey, welcome back those who skipped the spoiler section. So what I was saying is this game fucks with the mental states of its characters because the world of this artist doesn't want them to leave. The world continues to warp and distort around them, which in itself causes the world to become surreal. I think one of my favorite parts is towards the end with this crayon world. This feels about on par with some of the surreal elements in Yume Nikki, but unlike Yume Nikki, Ib has a narrative and isn't entirely senseless. I think Ib actually shows why I wasn't too big of a fan of Yume Nikki, because Ib does a fair bit of what Yume Nikki does, except it doesn't feel directionless. Again, this may just be a preference for me with some games, because after saying that, I've been reminded of why I don't really like too many open world games all that much. It can be easy to get lost and not quite understand what you're doing, and if the story isn't all that captivating or important, then what motivation would you have to keep going? Random example, but for as much as I like the gameplay in something like Just Cause 2 or Just Cause 3, I never felt inclined to actually finish the story, and if you were to ask me what the story was about, I could only give you the gist. But anyway, what Ib is great at, ultimately, is the storytelling and environment. This game wouldn't be nearly as interesting if the art, lore, wasn't as fleshed out as it is. It ultimately introduced a concept for a game, delivered on the concept, and left me wanting more. Not because the game didn't sufficiently do what it set out to do, but because I enjoyed it that much. So then, where can you play Ib? Is it a free game? Is it on Steam? Is there another version out there? Well, yes, to all those questions. When I started making this video, Ib was only available on VG Person's website if you wanted to play in English. It is a Japanese RPG Maker 2000 game, so yes, it is in fact an RPG Maker game. But recently, Ib was remade and released on Steam for $13. Yeah, that might be a bit steep. Now, the remake may have improved some things with this game, but as it currently stands, the remake is only in Japanese, to say the least. Trying to play this game with Google Translate is not very practical. It definitely isn't working quite as advertised. My best recommendation is to play the old version now, and when the remake gets an English translation, purchase the game just to support the original developer if you so want. Or wait until this remake gets fully translated, because it is possible this version could be the best version. I just can't really tell because I don't speak Japanese.